late 1944. The war in Europe is reaching its most critical moment. The Soviet Union continues its relentless advance, pushing closer to Germany with every battle. Entire German armies are being forced back, and the front lines are beginning to collapse under the pressure. In our timeline, this was the beginning of the end. But in this timeline, something is different. Germany is not as weak. The Western Allies are not yet in France. And for the first time in months, the German High Command believes the war might still be stabilized. Everything now depends on one question. Can Germany stop the Soviet advance? Because if they can, even for a short time, the entire outcome of the war could change. Welcome to Echoes of History, a channel dedicated to exploring the moments where history could have taken a different path. From the battles that shaped civilizations to the political decisions that changed the fate of nations, we examine alternate timelines and turning points that could have rewritten the world we know today. Because sometimes the smallest moment can echo across centuries. This is Echoes of History. As the Soviet advance pushed closer to Germany's core territory, the war entered its most decisive phase, where the outcome would be determined not by rapid breakthroughs, but by whether Germany could hold a final defensive line long enough to stabilize the front. German commanders understood that the vast territories of Eastern Europe could no longer be defended indefinitely, and instead began concentrating their remaining strength along key defensive positions closer to the German heartland. Rivers such as the Vistula and the Oder became critical natural barriers, offering strong defensive advantages that could slow Soviet armoured advances and force them into costly frontal assaults. German engineers worked rapidly to fortify these positions, constructing trenches, anti-tank obstacles, bunkers, and extensive minefields designed to channel Soviet attacks into predictable and heavily defended zones. What remained of Germany's armoured forces was carefully preserved and positioned behind the front lines, ready to respond to breakthroughs with counterattacks aimed at sealing gaps before they could expand. This marked a shift in German strategy from trying to hold territory to trying to hold time. Every mile was no longer equally important. Instead, commanders focused on defending positions that could maximize their limited resources while inflicting the highest possible losses on advancing Soviet forces. At the same time, German leadership recognized that this defensive effort represented their last realistic chance to change the direction of the war. If these lines failed quickly, the Soviet Union would have a clear path into Germany itself, and collapse would likely follow. But if the line could hold, even for a few months, it could create a dramatically different situation. The longer Germany delayed the Soviet advance, the more pressure would build elsewhere. The Western Allies were still regrouping after the failed invasion, and every month that passed without a second front increased the strategic uncertainty of the war. German commanders began coordinating their defences with greater flexibility, allowing for limited withdrawals when necessary in order to avoid encirclement and preserve combat effectiveness. This approach, though often at odds with Hitler's preference for holding ground at all costs, allowed some units to survive longer and remain effective in future battles. For the soldiers on the front lines, the situation was intense and unforgiving. They understood that they were defending not just territory, but the survival of their entire nation. Supplies were limited, reinforcements were often inexperienced, and the constant pressure of Soviet artillery and attacks made every defensive position feel temporary. Yet despite these challenges, German forces still possessed strengths that could not be ignored. Their defensive tactics had improved, their coordination in counterattacks remained effective, and when properly supplied, their armoured units could still deliver powerful strikes against overextended Soviet formations. The question was whether these strengths could be sustained long enough to make a difference. As Soviet forces prepared to launch their next wave of offensives, they now faced a German defence that was no longer stretched thin across vast territory, but concentrated, deliberate, and fighting with a clear understanding of what was at stake. The coming battles would not just determine how far the Soviet Union could advance, but whether Germany could transform a collapsing front into a stable line, and in doing so, open the door to a future that no longer guaranteed its defeat. As Soviet forces prepared their next wave of offensives, the conflict narrowed into a series of critical battles that would determine whether Germany's final defensive line could hold or collapse. Unlike earlier phases of the war, where vast territories were traded rapidly, these battles were fought over key positions that both sides understood could decide the outcome of the entire campaign. River crossings, major cities, and transportation hubs became focal points of intense fighting as Soviet commanders sought to break through German defences and maintain their momentum toward Germany itself. The Red Army launched massive assaults, supported by heavy artillery barrages, aiming to overwhelm German positions through sheer force. Tanks advanced across open ground, while infantry followed closely behind, attempting to exploit any breach in the defensive line. However, in this timeline, German forces were far more prepared for these attacks. Defensive positions had been carefully constructed to absorb the initial impact, with minefields and anti-tank weapons slowing Soviet armoured units as they approached. German artillery responded with concentrated fire, targeting advancing formations and attempting to disrupt the coordination of Soviet assaults. When Soviet breakthroughs occurred, German panzer divisions were committed quickly, launching counterattacks designed to isolate and destroy the advancing units before they could fully consolidate their gains. These counterattacks often resulted in chaotic and violent engagements, with tanks clashing at close range and both sides suffering heavy losses. In some sectors, German defences held firm, forcing Soviet forces into repeated assaults that drained their strength and slowed their progress. In others, the Red Army managed to push forward, capturing key positions after costly battles and forcing German units to withdraw to secondary lines. The fighting became a test of endurance as much as strategy. Each side committed its remaining reserves carefully, knowing that the outcome of these battles could not easily be reversed. For German commanders, the goal was not necessarily to win decisive victories, but to prevent decisive defeats. Holding the line for even a short period could have significant consequences, buying time and creating uncertainty in the broader war. For Soviet commanders, the objective remained clear: maintain pressure and prevent the Germans from stabilizing the front. Any delay in the advance risked giving Germany the opportunity it needed to regroup and strengthen its defences further. The intensity of the battles also placed enormous strain on both armies. Supplies were consumed at a rapid rate, and the constant fighting reduced the effectiveness of even experienced units. Weather conditions, terrain, and logistical challenges all played a role in shaping the outcome of individual engagements. Muddy ground slowed tank movements, damaged roads, hindered supply lines, and the destruction of infrastructure complicated efforts to maintain momentum. Despite these obstacles, the Soviet advance continued, though at a slower pace than before. German resistance had become more effective, forcing the Red Army to fight harder for each objective. The question was no longer whether the Soviets could advance, but whether they could do so quickly enough to prevent Germany from solidifying its defensive line. With each passing battle, the outcome of the war became more uncertain. Germany was still under immense pressure, but it was no longer collapsing as rapidly as before. Instead, the front began to show signs of stabilization in certain areas, raising the possibility, however slim, that the war might not end in the way many had expected. The pace of the war now began to change in subtle but important ways. As the relentless forward drive that had defined the Red Army's advance started to lose some of its speed, progress did not stop, but it became harder to sustain. Each new offensive required more preparation, more coordination, and increasingly strained supply lines. The deeper Soviet forces moved into contested territory, the more difficult it became to maintain the same level of pressure that had once driven rapid breakthroughs. Roads were damaged, rail networks disrupted, and the sheer distance from major supply hubs began to take its toll. At the same time, German defensive efforts were becoming more effective. Concentrated lines, supported by natural barriers and reinforced positions, allowed German forces to absorb attacks more efficiently than before. Instead of being forced into constant retreat, some units were now able to hold ground for longer periods, forcing repeated assaults that slowed the overall pace of the advance. Counterattacks, though limited, became more deliberate and better timed, striking Soviet units that had pushed too far ahead of their support. These engagements did not reverse the direction of the war, but they introduced something new: friction in the Soviet momentum. The psychological impact of this shift was significant on both sides. For German forces, the realization that the front could be stabilized, even temporarily, began to change how the war was perceived. What had once felt like an inevitable collapse now appeared less certain. Units that had been expecting constant retreat were now being ordered to hold, and in some cases they succeeded. That alone began to reshape morale. For Soviet forces, the change was more subtle but still important. Victory still seemed within reach, but it was becoming more costly and time-consuming than expected. Each offensive achieved gains, but not at the speed that earlier campaigns had delivered. The expectation of rapid breakthroughs gave way to a more grinding, methodical advance. This shift did not favour Germany outright, but it created conditions where time began to matter in a new way. Every delay allowed German defences to strengthen further. Every slowed advance increased the strain on Soviet logistics and manpower. Meanwhile, events beyond the battlefield added another layer of uncertainty. The Western Allies were still rebuilding their invasion capabilities, and while another landing remained inevitable, it was not immediate. The longer that delay continued, the more space Germany had to focus entirely on the east. This created a situation where the outcome of the war was no longer being driven by rapid movement, but by endurance and timing. If the advance regained its speed, the eventual collapse of Germany would likely follow. But if the pace continued to slow, even slightly, it opened the possibility that the front could stabilize into something far more prolonged. That possibility, once almost unthinkable, was now beginning to take shape. As the Soviet advance continued to slow and the expected rapid breakthroughs failed to materialize, frustration began to build at the highest levels of Soviet leadership, where success had always been measured not just by progress, but by speed. Reports arriving from the front painted a troubling picture. Advances were still being made, but at a far greater cost and with far less momentum than anticipated. Entire offensives that were expected to collapse German defences in days were now taking weeks, sometimes stalling entirely under heavy resistance. For many commanders on the ground, this was a natural consequence of stronger German defences and extended supply lines. But for Stalin, the explanation was far less simple. Suspicion began to take hold. The slowing of the offensive was not seen merely as a military problem, but as a potential sign of failure within the command structure itself. Stalin had long maintained a deep distrust of his generals, a trait that had defined his leadership even before the war. Now, as the advance toward Germany became more difficult, that distrust began to resurface with dangerous intensity. Questions were raised behind closed doors. Why were certain offensives not achieving their objectives? Why were German defences holding longer than expected? Were commanders acting with the necessary aggression, or were they hesitating? In Stalin's mind, hesitation could easily be interpreted as weakness, or worse, disloyalty. As these suspicions grew, pressure on Soviet commanders intensified. orders became more rigid, less tolerant of delay or deviation. Frontline generals were expected to deliver results, regardless of the conditions they faced. When those results did not come quickly enough, consequences followed. Officers were removed from command, replaced with others who were expected to act more decisively. Investigations were launched into failed operations, not simply to understand what had gone wrong, but to identify who might be responsible. The atmosphere within the Soviet command structure began to change. Decisions that had once been made based on tactical judgment were now influenced by fear of reprisal. Commanders became less willing to take calculated risks, knowing that failure could be interpreted as incompetence or betrayal. Coordination between units suffered as officers prioritized strict adherence to orders over flexibility on the battlefield. This shift did not immediately halt the Soviet advance, but it began to affect its effectiveness. Offensives became less adaptive, sometimes continuing under unfavorable conditions simply because orders demanded it. Opportunities to exploit German weaknesses were occasionally missed, while costly assaults were repeated even when their chances of success had diminished. Over time, these changes created cracks in what had once been a highly coordinated war effort. German commanders, observing these patterns, began to recognize the shift. The Red Army was still powerful, still advancing, but its movements were becoming more predictable and at times less efficient. This created new opportunities. Defensive lines that might have collapsed under more flexible Soviet tactics now held longer. Counterattacks became more effective against units that were advancing without adapting to changing conditions. For Germany, this was the first true sign that the war might be moving into a different phase. Not a victory, but a slowing, just enough to matter. The impact of Stalin's growing paranoia did not result in an immediate collapse of Soviet effectiveness, but it introduced friction at the highest levels of command. A war that had been driven by momentum now faced internal strain, and that strain began to ripple outward onto the battlefield. In a conflict where timing had become everything, even small disruptions could have significant consequences. And for the first time since the war had begun turning against Germany, there was a growing sense that the outcome was no longer entirely one-sided. What began as a slowing of the Soviet advance was now evolving into something far more significant, as the front lines in parts of Eastern Europe started to resemble a prolonged defensive struggle rather than a collapsing German retreat. The combination of reinforced German positions and growing strain within the Soviet command structure created conditions where neither side could easily achieve a decisive breakthrough. Advances still occurred, but they were incremental, measured in miles rather than sweeping movements across entire regions. In several sectors, German forces managed to hold key defensive lines for extended periods, forcing repeated Soviet assaults that yielded diminishing returns. These positions, often anchored around rivers, fortified cities, or carefully prepared defensive networks, became focal points of grinding battles that consumed time and resources on both sides. For the first time in years, the possibility of a stabilized front, however fragile, began to emerge. This did not mean the war had reached a true stalemate yet, but it suggested that such an outcome was no longer impossible. German commanders increasingly focused on preserving their remaining strength, avoiding unnecessary losses, while maximizing the defensive advantages of terrain and fortification. Rather than launching large-scale counter-offensives, they concentrated on disrupting Soviet advances and forcing them into costly engagements that slowed momentum further. On the other side, Soviet forces continued pushing forward, but the cumulative effects of logistical strain, higher casualties, and command pressure began to limit their ability to maintain continuous offensive operations at the same intensity. Pauses between major offensives became more frequent as units regrouped, resupplied, and reorganized. These pauses, though temporary, gave German forces valuable time to reinforce their positions and prepare for the next assault. Beyond the battlefield, the broader strategic situation added to the uncertainty. The Western Allies were still rebuilding their strength and planning a future return to continental Europe, but that return had not yet materialized. Each passing month without a second front increased the importance of what was happening in the east. If the Soviet advance slowed enough, it could shift the balance of the war from one of inevitable collapse to one of prolonged endurance. This raised a critical possibility. What if the war did not end quickly? A prolonged conflict would place increasing strain on all sides. Germany would continue to face shortages and economic pressure, but the Soviet Union would also bear the cost of sustained offensive operations, while the Western Allies would face growing political pressure to act. In such a scenario, the war could begin to change from a race to defeat Germany into a struggle over how long each side could continue fighting. For Germany, this represented the narrowest but most important path to survival. Victory in the traditional sense remained unlikely, but survival did not necessarily require victory. If the front could be stabilized long enough, the conditions of the war itself could begin to shift. Alliances could come under strain, priorities could change, and outcomes that once seemed impossible might become worth considering. The idea of a stalemate, once unthinkable given the scale of Soviet momentum, was now beginning to take shape as a distant but real possibility. And in that possibility lay the first true opening for a future where Germany did not simply collapse, but endured. What was once expected to be a rapid collapse was now transforming into something far more uncertain as the war stretched forward without a clear conclusion. The front lines in the east continued to shift, but no longer with the speed or decisiveness that had defined earlier campaigns. Instead, the conflict began to resemble a prolonged struggle of endurance, where both sides were forced to confront the limits of their resources, manpower, and strategic flexibility. German forces, though still under immense pressure, were no longer in full retreat across every sector. In some areas, defensive lines held for extended periods, forcing repeated Soviet assaults that produced only gradual gains. Each delay, each slowed advance added time that Germany desperately needed. That time began to ripple outward, beyond the battlefield. The longer the war continued without a decisive outcome, the more complex the global situation became. The Western Allies remained committed to defeating Germany, but the delay in reopening a Western front created growing pressure within their own governments and populations. Questions began to emerge about strategy, timing, and the long-term consequences of a war that no longer followed its expected course. At the same time, the Soviet Union faced the mounting cost of sustaining large-scale offensives against increasingly resilient defences. Casualties remained high, supply lines stretched thin, and the internal strain within the command structure continued to affect the efficiency of operations. None of these factors alone were enough to stop the Soviet advance, but together they began to reshape the pace and nature of the conflict. For Germany, this evolving situation represented the only viable path forward. The objective was no longer to win in a traditional sense, but to avoid losing completely. Survival became the goal. If the war could be prolonged long enough, new possibilities could begin to emerge. Possibilities rooted not in battlefield victories, but in shifting political and strategic conditions. A prolonged conflict could strain the alliance between the Soviet Union and the Western Allies, whose long-term interests were not perfectly aligned. It could create opportunities for negotiation, for repositioning, or for outcomes that were not originally part of the war's trajectory. This did not guarantee a favourable result for Germany, but it meant that the outcome was no longer fixed. The war had entered a phase where time itself had become a weapon, Every month that passed without a decisive breakthrough increased the complexity of the situation and reduced the certainty of any single outcome. The question was no longer simply who would win, but how the war would end and under what conditions. In this timeline, the possibility now existed that World War II might not conclude with total victory or total defeat, but with something far more ambiguous. A war that does not end quickly becomes a war that can change shape. And in that transformation lies the most dangerous and unpredictable outcome of all. The war in Europe has reached a moment no one expected. What once seemed like the inevitable collapse of Nazi Germany has slowed into something far more uncertain. The Soviet Union continues to advance, but at a cost that grows heavier with every mile, while Germany, battered and outmatched, is no longer falling apart as quickly as before. Instead, it is holding barely. And in that narrow space between collapse and survival, a new possibility begins to emerge. Not victory, not domination, but endurance. If Germany can continue to delay, if the front can remain stable even for a short time longer, the entire shape of the war could begin to change. Alliances could strain, strategies could shift, and a conflict once defined by total defeat could become something far more complicated. So now the question becomes, is this the beginning of Germany's last stand, or the moment where the war stops being inevitable? I want to hear what you think. Does Germany collapse under the pressure, or do they manage to hold on and force a completely different outcome? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one. If you're enjoying this alternate history series, make sure to like the video and subscribe to Echoes of History. And in the next episode, we explore what happens if Germany actually stabilizes the front, and what that means for the future of Europe and the world. History is full of moments where everything could have changed. If you enjoyed exploring this alternate timeline, let me know what you think in the comments below. What other turning points in history should we explore next? If you enjoy alternate history and stories about the decisions that shaped our world, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Echoes of History so you don't miss future episodes. And if you're curious about how history might have unfolded differently in another moment, be sure to check out the next video on the channel, because sometimes the smallest moment can echo through history forever.